Let's talk about faith. Faith is should be at least what keeps us going. And there are many, many examples, of course, of people of great faith in Scripture. And it's good to look at them because they are there for our benefit. And today I want to look at Moses. And I want to first go to Acts. Chapter 7, verse 22. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. Okay, I just want to put this verse as a note aside for us to remember, because often when we read the story of Moses, especially in the beginning of his calling, we forget that he was actually learned in wisdom of the Egyptians, that he was mighty in words, and we think that he was a bit underdog in the way he talks to God, and I cannot speak, I'm not so eloquent and all this, but this is actually what is being told about him. So now I want to go to Hebrews 11, Hebrews chapter 11, the chapter about faith, and Moses is mentioned there in verse 24 through 27. And I will come back to this towards the end of this message today. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God, than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So from these verses we see Moses deliberately chose the route that he was to go, although of course he didn't know what it would all bring at that time, but he made choices. Moses had really everything a man could wish at that period in time. He was basically at the top of the world. But then he chose freely, as we just read, to go with his brethren, the Hebrews, who were despised people at that moment. He gave up a lot. So I want to first look at what did he give up. First of all, his position. As said, he had the highest position you could think. He was actually poised to be the ruler, the next ruler of Egypt, the next pharaoh, because historians think that Moses' adoptive mother, the daughter of the pharaoh, was the only child of the pharaoh, so there was no other successor than Moses. He would be the next ruler of the Egyptian kingdom or empire. So he had the highest possible position, and he gave it up. He just put it aside. All this status, this greatness. That is a huge thing if you think of it, and it goes very much against human nature, and we see it actually these days around us, even here on the island, where we have elections for mayor, and you see how so many people are really lusting for this position of power, to be in control, to have this higher position than all the others. But we see it also, of course, in the European elections, that also these days people are crazy for power. And next year you will see also in the United States the race for president. It's again the same thing. People people have this I would say lust for power in them. So to be in this highest possible position and to just lay it aside is actually, it goes against human nature. But this is what he did. He gave up his position. The second thing, which we also read here from Hebrews 11, he gave up pleasure. It says the pleasures of sin for a season. Egypt was a very developed nation. There were great artists, there were great architects, the monuments of that stand until this day. There was a lot of wealth, and there was intellectual pleasure, there was the social pleasure and even sensual pleasure, and he had everything at his disposal. He could order it, whatever he desired and whenever. So pleasure, he gave up pleasure. And the third thing I want to mention is riches. He gave up riches. He was at the top of the chain. He was the richest, well, next to the Pharaoh, obviously, but you could not get any more wealthy than that. And so the second most craved thing by men in general, next to power, is riches. People want to be rich. Everyone in the world, well, not everyone, but in general, wants to have wealth, wants to be rich, wants to be able to buy and do whatever he or she wants. Egypt was very rich empire, and Moses was at the top. So he had everything, and he gave up riches. Now, if you go through this, well, at least came immediately to my mind, you see already there the foreshadow of the Messiah. Moses obviously is a type of the Messiah, of Jesus. But if you think of these three things, the position, the pleasure, and the riches, that is exactly what Jesus gave up. He gave up his position next to the throne of God in heaven. He gave up and he came down to become one of us, like Moses came down from his position to become one of the despised ones, the lowest in the whole society, the slaves, the workers, the Hebrews. And so Jesus did that, and he left also pleasure. Heaven is a place without sin, without pain, without sorrow, without death, without darkness. It's very pleasurable, actually. That's real pleasure, not compared to anything in this world. Jesus had to leave that behind to go down in this valley of darkness and death. And riches. In Colossians 1st chapter, we read that everything was created for him, by him, and through him, and everything is held together by him. So Jesus had all the riches, everything, the whole creation at his feet. And he had also laid that aside to become one of us. So we see that foreshadow, but rather than seeing Moses as a foreshadow, I want to look at him as someone living a Christ-like life, because that is what Paul also writes in several instances that we should do. We should imitate Jesus. He says, like I imitate Jesus, you do so too. And even Jesus himself says, you call me master, that's good, then do what I do. Use me as your example. Live a Christ-like life. And so Moses lived a Christ-like life, although he didn't have the revelation of Jesus, obviously. So that's what he gave up. Then the thing is, what did he get instead? What did he choose? Well, he chose suffering and affliction. Very much so. He saw the suffering of the children of Israel, and he knew, of course, very well their position. It was the lowest in society. There were not even real Egyptians. Against all logic, he chose their side. And with that, their suffering and their affliction. He chose the company of despised people. He was in the company of the loved ones, the admired ones, a pharaoh in Egypt in those days was considered a god. He had a god status, so he was like that. But he chose the company of people that were actually despised. And if you think of that, most people would not have done that, even if they had something good in their heart, even if they had some sympathy for these Hebrews. Most people in such a position would have reasoned, well, from my position I can try to better their circumstances. This is what politicians and celebrities do. They have a lot of money, they do philanthropic work, they donate to some cause, and that is how they ease their conscience and show to the world that they are good people. But actually that's just for themselves. It's usually fake. Moses could have done that. He could have said, well, I will wait until I will succeed the Pharaoh, and then I will change the position, better the position of my people, the Hebrews. But he didn't. He chose their company, their side, 100%. He became one of them, he became even less. So that's what he chose. He chose also reproach, and to be scorned, to be hated. By leaving Pharaoh's court and joining Israel, people would consider him a fool. Lost his mind. There is obviously never a way back. He would not say, sorry, I made the wrong choice, here I am again. No, there's no way back. This, in the eyes of the people, this was madness. And he did not make these choices because he was silly or because he was weak. And that's why I wanted to read this verse in Acts 7, verse 22 first. He was mighty in words and deeds, and he had the wisdom of, he was learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians. He was not a silly person who had lost his mind, not at all. He knew what he was doing. And again we see here the foreshadow, if you will, of what Jesus would do. Moses chose the suffering and affliction. Well, that's what Jesus did. If we briefly go to Philippians chapter 2, verse 7, and this part here, first 10 verses or so of Philippians 2 show clearly that Jesus put aside his divinity, his position, the things that we mentioned before. As we sometimes have this discussion that people say, yeah, but he was still fully God while he was man. This doesn't go, of course, and this is clear here. But here in verse 7 it says, but Jesus made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of man. So he chose to be a servant, to suffer for others. Like the children of Israel, they were servants to the Egyptians, and Moses chose to become one of them. And actually, we would be even less. And of course, we find this also in the Old Testament, in Isaiah 53, the forbidden chapter. And we are reading from it quite a bit lately. There is no chapter in the Old Testament that is more explicit, speaking about Jesus as the Messiah, and how he would fulfill that role. And we could read the whole chapter, but I will take only a few verses. Verse 11 here, Isaiah 53, verse 11. It says, he shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. So here again, it speaks about the coming Messiah, that he will be a servant, and that he shall bear the iniquities of the people. And that's why this chapter is called, one of the reasons why this chapter is called the forbidden chapter. The Jewish rabbis don't want to read this because it reveals actually that Jesus was the Messiah. Whereas they have a picture of the Messiah as one being a king, a hero who will bring prosperity and peace and freedom and all this, not a suffering servant. But that is what we know to be the reality. So Jesus chose also the company of despised people, the company of sinners. And again, it's here also in Isaiah 53 in chapter 4, verse 4, sorry. Surely he had borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. He chose to carry our sorrows. Like Moses chose to carry the sorrows of the children of Israel. And like Moses, for this he was rejected, obviously, by the court of the Pharaoh and the people around there. Likewise, Jesus was despised and rejected. In verse 3, here, again, Isaiah 53, it says, he is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised and we esteemed him not. This is the position that our great Lord chose for our sakes. And also in Psalm 22, Psalm of David, which is also a messianic psalm, foreshadowing actually the crucifixion. Psalm 22, verse 6. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of man and despised of the people. So this, of course, prophetically, it's actually Jesus speaking here, 1200 years before the actual event. So that is what he got in return of giving up his position. And so in that Moses was very much Christ-like. So the question is then, if we see what he gave up and what he chose, what moved him to do so? What moved him to do so? And many people might say, well, it was just an impulse. He saw this injustice being done to the children of Israel, and in an impulse he killed actually one of the Egyptian guards, and all the events happened. But as we just read from Hebrews 11, it was not by impulse. It says in verse 23 that by faith, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Yeah. By faith, he chose affliction over the pleasures of sin for a season. And again, it's the verbs that show what he did. He refused and he chose. And by faith, he esteemed reproach higher than the riches and treasures of Egypt. And by faith, he forsook Egypt. And Egypt is a picture of the old life, the life before salvation. So it's by faith that he was moved to do so. And only faith can move also us to do the same thing, to give up things that we treasure and to choose things that seem not desirable, and to see actually beyond all that. So looking at this, the question is now for ourselves, what do we do with this? What are our choices? Well, first of all, if we see what happened as soon as Moses made this choice, he had to leave Egypt. He had to leave. There was no longer a place for him there. And so this is the same for us. We have to leave Egypt. We have to leave the world, the old life. If we stay in there, we will perish. Moses would have died, obviously. He would not have made it. But the thing in the beautiful word there in Hebrews 11 is that he chose to no longer be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. We have to choose to be no longer called sons or daughters of the world. That is not where we belong. So that is a choice, and the choice has to be made by faith. And it can only be made by faith. And it comes with costs. We just saw what Moses had to give up. It was a lot. And so the same for us. We might have to give up a lot. And it may feel hard in the beginning, but actually when the faith is strong, it doesn't feel hard at all because you know the reward. But in the eyes of the world, it seems foolish, of course. But it comes with costs. We spoke about counting the costs some weeks ago, and I also made this remark. Faith without costs is worthless. Faith without costs is worthless, and true faith is priceless. It comes also with a cross. If there is no cross, then there will be no crown. This is the reward that Paul speaks of so often, but also Jesus reveals in Revelation chapter 2 and 3. It has to be by faith, not by knowledge, not by feelings, not by emotions. And I mention these things on purpose because that is what we usually see in Christianity. We see knowledge, feelings and emotions, and that's driving the people, and not faith. Knowledge cannot stand against persecution, against hardship, against affliction. Knowledge doesn't bring you anything. So it's nice as long as everything goes well. Yes, it will sound great, but when the hard times come, it falls apart. Feelings, they change. It's just like the weather. Today you feel this, tomorrow you feel something else. It's no basis. If Moses would have acted on feelings, for sure, some days later when he would be out of Egypt, he would have felt differently. He would have thought, what did I do? I had this beautiful life and all these riches, and now I'm here in the wilderness. Because feelings change. And emotions, they come and go. And they are very much depending on circumstances, very much. And circumstances change, so the emotions will change as well. So we cannot go by that. And you see that those believers that go by this, they have to seek all the time these things again. They have to seek the emotions. So they have to create an environment to feed these feelings and emotions. And so you will see that their worship ceremonies are focused on that, on creating an atmosphere to create again these feelings and emotions, so that we feel quote unquote spiritual again. But it can only last so long, obviously. But faith, as Hebrews 11 verse 1 says, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So that is again contradictory to what the world thinks that faith is. It's substance, it's a security, it's a certainty. And the faith obviously has to be in Jesus and in Him alone. He is the substance of our faith. In Colossians 2 verse 17, Paul writes, Christ is the body. He is the substance. He embodies the faith. He is also our daily bread. That's what we feed on, what we live on. That's why it's daily bread. It's not one time you take it and you're okay. No, you have to feed it on it daily. Like the manna in the desert, it was daily. You could not keep it for 2 days. It would go bad. You had to take it every day again. And there is this expression in the world that says, you are what you eat. And this is true in many ways, also physically, biologically, but it's also spiritually true. You are what you eat. If you eat a lot from Scripture, this is what becomes part of you, what begins to live in you and through you. So that is how we sustain the faith and make it grow. Now, faith, as I said, in worldly terms, it's often equated to thinking something. I believe that tomorrow it will be good weather. That has uncertainty in it. That is how the world thinks of faith. Well, you believe in the church, but here in the workplace we do it this or that way. You know, these kind of expressions. But scripturally, it's the opposite. Faith is security, it's certainty, as we just said it. It's substance and it's evidence. It is to be sure. And there are only two states. Either you believe or you don't. There is nothing in between. You cannot believe a little bit. Either you believe or you don't. If you have faith that is where you think I believe a bit, then you will find out that when it is put to the test, it doesn't exist. There is nothing. When David ran towards Goliath, he would either kill Goliath or he would get killed. There would be no other option. And this is the same. We face our Goliath, we face the enemy. Either we kill him by the victory that we have through Jesus' blood, or we get killed. There's no other way. And so faith is massively important. And you see that knowledge cannot bring this. Emotions, feelings cannot bring this. Just imagine this teenager, David, running towards this giant. And, I feel like today I might be lucky. This would not have happened, obviously. Then he would never have gone there. He was sure. He believed that he would kill him. And this was faith in his God. Moses, he forsook the riches of Pharaoh's court. He forsook Egypt, as Hebrews 11:27 says. By faith he forsook Egypt. And what did he get in return? And we tend to think of all the great things he did, leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, when the sea parted and all these great miracles. But no, what did he get in return? He became a shepherd in the wilderness of Midian. And from this palace where he was with the servants and the nice food and everything, he was walking in the dirt with a bunch of sheep. And he was actually, as it says beautifully in Exodus 2, verse 22, the second half of this verse, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. He was added to the ranks of Abram, Isaac and Jacob, who were all strangers in strange land. They were sojourners, they were without a home. Also in Acts 7, verse 29, it says the same. Then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. He was a stranger in a strange land. So this is what we have to ask ourselves. Are we strangers in a strange land? Or do we feel at home in this world? If we feel at home, we haven't left Egypt. And of course it's not always so black and white. Unfortunately, sometimes we have days that we feel at home and then we have days we feel estranged. But we should actually be like Moses. We should be strangers in a strange land. We don't belong here. And so there was Moses in the desert, in the wilderness, far away from Egypt. And it wasn't for a few days or a few weeks, a few months. It was 40 long years. And he was already 40 years of age when he left Egypt. 40 long years he was living a very simple life. And as far as we know, and I'm pretty sure about this, there was no, God was not speaking to him. He knew God, of course, he knew the God of his people from his early years, because although he was found by Pharaoh's daughter, he was raised by his own mother the first few years, and so he knew about his God, or the God of his people, and he put it that way, but he did not know him. He had faith, he believed, but he didn't know him, he hadn't met him. That happened all the way in the end of these 40 years that he was being a shepherd, when he met God, or God met him rather, at this burning bush. And God called his name Moses, Moses. And that is, from that moment on, God began to speak to him and a lot, as we read all throughout the Torah, all the time, all these chapters begin, and God said to Moses, and God said to Moses and Aaron. So God would speak to him a lot, but these 40 years that he was there, he was leading a simple life. He had actually no idea what God had in store for him. He was 80 years, maybe 79, when he saw this burning bush, and God spoke to him. You see, there is patience, there is endurance, he was content with a simple life. Again, this goes against human nature. We want to do big things, and you see it. Many ministries, they want to go out and heal people and do all kinds of theatrical and big things and make a lot of noise. But if God does not ask that from you to do, don't. Then don't. He didn't ask anything from Moses, so Moses didn't do anything, but just lead a simple life, and he was content with it. In Exodus 2, verse 21, it literally says this. Of course, it was by God's providence that Moses was led to Jethro, who was a priest with his 7 daughters there. God had prepared it that way, and it says then, and Moses was content to dwell with a man. And he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter. And we read, of course, later that when Moses is finally called to go back to Egypt to lead the children of Israel out of there, that it was actually Zipporah, his wife, that circumcised his son, because he had not done that. So we see that the faith and the knowledge of it was there. So he was not completely without God, but God had not yet given him any commission, let me put it that way. So he was content with his simple life, and he led it for 40 years until he reached the age of 80. And humanly spoken, at 80, your life is over. This is what it is. Then it's done. But you see, for God, this does not work this way. He has a whole different timing, and he has different plans. And with this simplicity, he could work. Moses had to go through this in order to be ready for the task that God had for him. And there is, of course, much more to it, because as a result of wandering in this wilderness for 40 years, he knew every spot and every rock. He knew exactly the whole area. And that was to his benefit, because he would dwell there another 40 years, but with another flock. This was God's people. So God was actually preparing him without him knowing it. And that's often so in our lives, when we think, well, nothing is happening, and there's no big thing in my faith, there's no spurt, nothing spectacular happening here. Just stay in your faith. Just trust the Lord. Just wait for him, and see, you will find out that he is actually preparing you for something. And it's often the little unexpected things. It's this little pebble that when you read that David went to the river to take a few pebbles. What can you do with a few pebbles? There was Saul with his mighty army with all their weaponry, but it was to no avail. It was a little pebble that did the job. And even David tried on the armor of Saul, but it didn't feel right. So all this spectacle that we often seek as believers, that's not what we need. We need a little pebble, and God will provide this, and he will prepare us for it. And so there was patience and there was endurance, something that Moses learned in these 40 years for sure, because in the court of Egypt, of the Pharaoh, he didn't need patience. He could just flip his fingers and he would get what he wanted. He didn't need endurance. Everything was at his feet, but he learned it here. And we need it also in our faith, in our walk with the Lord. In Matthew 24 verse 13 Jesus says, he that endures to the end, the same will be saved. There is this endurance. It's not always an easy walk, and it's not always short in our understanding of time. In 2 Timothy 4 verse 7, Paul also says, I have finished the course and I have kept the faith. He makes this comparison with running a race. When you run a race, you have to endure until the finish. Actually, towards the finish, you have to give it a bit more to make sure that you are the first one to cross the finish line. So there is this endurance, this perseverance. And also in Revelation 3 verse 11, Jesus says, hold fast to what you have so that no one might take your crown. So you have to hold fast. Again, there is this endurance, this continuing in it, and staying strong. It is not, we cannot just take it for granted that once we are saved, everything will go smoothly. No, we have to stay with it, keep trusting and endure. One can only do great things for God if one has great faith, is often said. And it is true, but great faith is not great. In that sense, it's strong faith. It's not great that many people will see how spiritual you are and that you can use high spiritual language. No, it can be very humble, and no one might notice so much. Like Moses, these 40 years in the desert. But the faith is strong. Of course, we find in the New Testament this comparison of the mustard seed, which is just a little seed. It's small, but Jesus says if you have faith like a mustard seed, you can move mountains. Why? Because the potential in that seed is to grow a massive tree. And so, but it has to be strong. That is the point. And Moses, he indeed was used mightily by God. And he saw his share of signs. Well, we can only, we have it here written, we can imagine, but it's what the things that God did through him, it was of course magnificent. Many signs and wonders, and even as we went through Revelation chapter 11 and talked about the two witnesses, we saw also that God promises Moses, when he shows him toward the end of his life from the mountain, the promised land, he promises him that he will do great things in that land. But Moses, we know, he never entered Canaan, but he will soon, I believe, be one of these two witnesses and do great miracles again. Or God will do great miracles through him. So even 120 years that he lived on this earth, God is not finished with using him. It is strong faith, enduring, and God can do mighty things. And it's the same strong faith that brought Joshua and Caleb into the promised land. And these were two men from, estimate of 2 million, probably more, probably it could have been up to 6 million people. So from those that were over 20, only 2 entered the promised land. It's 1 in a million. It's very sobering if you think of it. It's very sobering. True faith means to give up the world. It means to give up its pleasures and its riches. And it means to choose to be despised and rejected. And thus to not compromise. But it also means an eternal reward that is beyond measure. We have to keep that before us. And so, if you think of that, our prayer should very much be like what the apostles asked Jesus. And I like that you see how the apostles learned the lessons that Jesus taught them. Because in one instance they say, teach us how to pray. It's a very simple question. And you think of all the things you can ask when you have Jesus in front of you, you ask this. And he did miracles. He silenced the sea and he raised the dead and healings and all this. But they asked him, teach us how to pray. And they saw, of course, that he was in constant communication with the Father, and that this was where all this came from. They wanted to also have this relationship. And so in another instance, in Luke 17, verse 5, they ask him, Lord, increase our faith. Increase our faith, because we need faith. We need strong faith. And the rest will follow. So I want to finish with another prayer of Moses himself, which is recorded in Psalms, Psalm 90. It's one of my favorite psalms for different reasons. And Psalm 90 is a prayer of Moses. I want to read the last portion of it from verse 13. Return, O Lord, how long? And let it repent thee concerning thy servants. O satisfy us early with thy mercy, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad according to the days wherein thou hast afflicted us, and the years wherein we have seen evil. Let thy work appear unto thy servants, and thy glory unto their children. And let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish thou the work of our hands upon us. Yeah, the work of our hands, establish thou it. Amen.